In 1942, the map of Asia told a grim story. China, ancient, proud, wounded, was bleeding beneath the weight of a brutal occupation. Its cities bombed, its railroads cut, and its armies starved of weapons. It was a nation hanging by a thread. And yet just 3 years later, that same crippled country stood among the 5 great powers of the world, seated next to giants like the United States and the Soviet Union. How is that even possible? How does a fractured nation, torn between rival factions and battered by war, emerge in just 36 months as the representative of Asia on the global stage? The answer lies in a web of shifting strategies, unexpected alliances, and brutal choices made under impossible conditions. It is a story of a country that was not saved by strength, but by endurance. Let's rewind to the early 1940s, specifically to the dead center of the Second World War. By 1942, the war in China had already raged for 5 years. The Japanese invasion, which began in full in 1937, had seen the rapid conquest of major urban centers: Shanghai, Nanjing, Wuhan. But instead of collapsing entirely, China resisted. It fought in towns, villages, rivers, and mountains, clinging to life like a wounded animal too stubborn to die. Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the nationalist government, had fled inland. His capital at Nanjing had fallen, and atrocities like the rape of Nanjing had shocked the world, though few acted. The Soviet Union offered some aid, so did a few Westerners, but China stood mostly alone, and yet it had not been defeated. Japan had spread itself thin. Its supply lines stretched across a vast host of land. Guerrilla resistance was constant, and despite years of war, Japan had not been able to destroy the Chinese military, but China, too, was at its limit. Its economy was in ruins. Its army was massive on paper, but undersupplied, fractured, and often poorly trained. China needed modern weapons, and someone willing to send them. That moment came in December 1941, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and brought the United States into the war. From this point forward, the war in Asia was no longer just a regional fight between China and Japan. It had become a global conflict, and both sides, Japan and China, changed their strategies accordingly. Japan's goal was to knock out the Western colonial powers in Asia, seizing their oil, rubber, and mineral resources. If it could destroy their ability to fight, it could free up troops to finally crush China. China, on the other hand, now had a different hope. If it could hold the line long enough, Western powers, especially the United States, would arm and supply China to finish the job of repelling Japan. The war that had become a stalemate would now become a race between Japan's collapse of Western influence and China's transformation into a modern fighting force. And at first, it seemed Japan was winning. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces launched lightning strikes across the Pacific. They captured the Philippines, crushed British defenses in Singapore, and seized the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. Burma, Britain's eastern colony, became the crucial link between Allied supplies and China. It was known as the Burma Road, a vital artery that kept China alive. Japan, realizing this, attacked. In a series of brutal battles in early 1942, Japanese forces pushed Allied troops out of Burma. With the road lost, China's supply line was cut. Chiang Kai-shek had sent some of his best units to help defend Burma. Now, they were either lost or trapped beyond reach. China was alone again. But then, something unexpected happened, not on Chinese soil, but thousands of miles away. In the heart of the Pacific, in April 1942, just months after Pearl Harbor, the United States launched a daring air raid on Tokyo. The famous Doolittle Raid didn't inflict massive damage, but it shattered Japan's sense of invulnerability. Worse, the American bombers had launched from aircraft carriers and landed in areas of China still under Chinese control. Some were helped by Chinese civilians. Others crash-landed. Japan responded with fury. It invaded and devastated the regions of eastern China, where the bombers had landed, killing tens of thousands of civilians in reprisals. But more importantly, it set the stage for a naval disaster that would tilt the balance of the Pacific War. Determined to prevent further raids, the Japanese Navy sought to destroy America's remaining aircraft carriers. They launched an offensive toward Midway, the farthest tip of the Hawaiian island chain, but the Americans were waiting. In the Battle of Midway, fought in June 1942, the United States ambushed and sank 4 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers. It was a blow Japan would never recover from. From that moment forward, Japan was on the defensive. It could no longer expand across the Pacific. Instead, it had to reinforce to dig in to stop the slow, grinding Allied advance that would now come from sea and sky. And what of China? With Japan forced to shift resources to defend its Pacific holdings, its pressure on China began to ease. No longer the primary focus, China was given breathing space, and it used that space to adapt its strategy. The Burma Road was gone. So instead, the Allies began what would become the largest sustained airlift in history, flying supplies over the Himalayas from India into Western China. The route was dangerous. Planes crashed constantly. Weather was brutal, but it kept China alive. Still, the amount of supplies was tiny. Chiang Kai-shek faced a hard decision. He couldn't arm all his forces, so he didn't even try. Instead, he prioritized building up the American air presence in China, helping the Allies strike Japanese positions from the air, including the famous Flying Tigers and later the U.S. 14th Air Force. The rest of China's forces were left largely under-equipped. This choice to prioritize Allied air power over Chinese ground offensives would shape the next 2 years of the war. By the time 1944 arrived, the entire balance of power in Asia was shifting. Japan, once the aggressor, was now being bled dry. The United States had retaken the Solomons, New Guinea, and was moving toward the Philippines. Its submarine fleet prowled the Pacific, sinking Japanese shipping by the ton. Oil, rubber, tin, the lifeblood of Japan's war machine, was being cut off. Factories back home could no longer replace the weapons lost in battle. Japan knew it had to act fast, but not in the Pacific. In China, here lies one of the war's stranger paradoxes. Japan launched its last major land offensive of the war, not against the Americans, but against the Chinese. The reason? Logistics. Japanese generals understood that in order to continue resisting the Americans in the Pacific, they needed to neutralize a key threat: the American bombers flying from Chinese airfields. These bombers were harassing Japanese shipping, infrastructure, and troop positions, all from the relative safety of bases deep inside China. So, in mid-1944, Japan launched Operation Ichigo, the largest land offensive in its history. Over 500,000 men were thrown into central and southern China. The goal was twofold: destroy Allied air bases used for raids on Japanese territory, link up Japan's fragmented territorial holdings across China and French Indochina by securing key railways. The Chinese Nationalist Army was unprepared. Their best divisions were still stuck in Burma, guarding the reopening of the Allied supply route. and the bulk of Chiang Kai-shek's forces were still poorly armed, underfed, and demoralized. The Japanese advance was swift. They cut down through Hunan, smashing through the once defiant city of Changsha, a city that had repelled Japanese attacks 3 times before. This time, there would be no stand. Further south, the Chinese tried to fortify Hengyang, then Guilin, but the Japanese brought reinforcements from their southern coastal enclaves, closing the jaws from 2 sides. Guilin fell. Guangzhou, the major port near Hong Kong, was threatened. The railways were now fully under Japanese control, opening up a protected overland supply route from Southeast Asia back to Japan. It seemed, in the moment, like a spectacular Japanese victory. But it was an illusion. Behind the front lines, Japan had overextended. Its army, though victorious in battle, could no longer hold what it had taken. It had no reserves to call upon, no fuel to move its troops rapidly, no margin for error, and most critically, it had achieved nothing that could stop the inevitable American tide in the Pacific. The submarine still sank its merchant fleet. The American island hopping campaign continued, unbroken. The air bases Japan captured in China, they were already obsolete, as the Americans had moved to new, closer airfields in the Marianas, from where the B-29 superfortresses could now strike Tokyo directly. It was a classic example of strategic blindness. Japan had won a battle, but it had lost the war. Meanwhile, China, for all its suffering, was finally approaching a turning point. In early 1945, Allied forces in Burma achieved their long-sought goal. They reopened the Doolittle Raid, linking India to China by land once more. It was a brutal campaign. The terrain was jungle, mountains, malaria-ridden swamps, but Chinese and British forces pushed through. By spring of that year, trucks laden with Allied supplies were once again rolling into Yunnan. This changed everything. Chiang Kai-shek's best divisions, previously starved of weapons, were now being rapidly modernized. American trainers helped reorganize and re-equip the Chinese army into divisions capable of offensive operations. For the first time since 1937, China had the tools and the will to push the Japanese back, but fate had other plans. Just as China prepared to launch its long-awaited counterattack, another storm broke over the horizon. You see, while China was rebuilding, the global chessboard was shifting. The Allies were preparing for the final act of the war, the invasion of Japan itself. The Americans had taken Iwo Jima and Okinawa at horrific cost. Their next step would be a direct assault on the Japanese home islands, an operation that promised to be bloodier than anything yet seen. But the Americans had a secret, and soon, the world would know it. In July 1945, the first successful test of the atomic bomb was completed in the deserts of New Mexico. 1 month later, 2 bombs, one on Hiroshima, the other on Nagasaki, brought the apocalypse to Japan's doorstep. The war, after nearly 8 years of slaughter in China, was over in a matter of days. In this final stage, the Japanese began to retreat from China in disarray. Their command collapsed. Morale evaporated. Logistics failed. And the Chinese, now rearmed and determined, moved in to reclaim what was theirs. They reoccupied key ports. They secured railways. They reestablished political control over cities long under foreign rule. But just as victory arrived, so too did a new danger. One not from Japan, but from within. The Second Sino-Japanese War had finally ended, and with it, the broader cataclysm of World War II in Asia. China had endured more than 8 years of total war, longer than any other major power. It had suffered over 15 million deaths. the devastation of entire provinces, the collapse of its infrastructure, and the scattering of its industries inland, but it has survived barely. And now, it stood among giants. When the United Nations was founded in the fall of 1945, 5 permanent seats were created on its newly formed Security Council. The United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, and China. It was a remarkable outcome. A country that had been on the brink of collapse in 1942 was now sitting at the diplomatic table alongside history's greatest empires. A wounded dragon, now recognized as a power broker of the post-war world. But appearances were deceiving. Behind the polished veneer of international legitimacy, China was fracturing. The war had not healed its wounds. It had deepened them. The nationalist government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, had claimed victory. Its troops had marched back into Beijing and Shanghai. Its officials sat at global conferences and collected the rewards of the Allied win. But across wide swaths of the Chinese countryside, another force had risen. The Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, had expanded its control over enormous areas during the war. While the nationalists had focused on conventional warfare and diplomacy, the communists had organized resistance movements, built local governments, and gained support from rural populations. Disillusioned by the chaos, when Japan surrendered, it left a void. And nature abhors a vacuum. In the north, Soviet forces entered Manchuria, once a Japanese puppet state. They seized Japanese equipment, handed much of it to the Chinese communists, and withdrew. In the south, the Americans supported the return of the nationalist regime. They airlifted thousands of nationalist troops into strategic cities, hoping to avoid a communist takeover. The uneasy peace between the two Chinese factions didn't last. By 1946, China descended into a full-blown civil war, one even more bitter than the fight against Japan. The communists were now armed, organized, and ideologically driven. The nationalists, though still supported by the West, were corrupt, exhausted, and increasingly losing public support. And so, China, the great survivor of World War II, became a new battleground, not between empires this time, but between visions of what China should become. Yet, even amid the chaos that followed, the legacy of China's wartime endurance echoed far and wide. For Japan, defeat brought not just humiliation, but transformation. The American occupation dismantled the Japanese military, rewrote its constitution, and launched a wave of economic reforms that would, paradoxically, lead to Japan's post-war rise as a peaceful economic powerhouse. But for China, the consequences were more ambiguous. The war had taught China the cost of isolation. Chiang Kai-shek had learned that without external support from the Americans, the British, the Soviets, China could not stand against modern enemies. Mao Zedong, on the other hand, had learned a different lesson. That power lay not in tanks or aircraft, but in the loyalty of the people, the control of land, and the ability to fight a war of attrition. Both men were products of the same war. Both would lead China in very different ways into the Cold War era, and the world would never be the same. There is something almost mythic about China's wartime transformation. It is not a tale of swift triumph, nor of Xinye's generals or decisive victories. It is a tale of survival, of a civilization being ground down, month after month, year after year, and choosing to endure. China did not win because it was strong. It won because it refused to die. And in that refusal, it outlasted the empire that tried to destroy it. But the irony is sharp. Victory did not bring peace. It brought another storm, a civil war, a revolution, and decades of division that would shape the global order for generations. The guns fell silent in 1945. But for China, the war never truly ended. The nation had expelled its invader. It had stood alongside the victors of a global conflict. Its flag now flew beside those of empires that had ruled the oceans for centuries. And yet, behind every photograph of handshakes and parades, there lurked a deeper question. Whose China had won the war? The China that had sat in San Francisco and signed the United Nations Charter? Or the China that had moved in the shadows, gathering strength in the villages, the valleys, and the hills? For years, both visions of China had fought the Japanese, but rarely together. One wore khaki uniforms and spoke in the halls of power. The other marched barefoot through rice paddies and held court in guerrilla strongholds. And when the occupier vanished, these two Chinas turned to face each other. The civil war that followed was not just a contest for territory, it was a reckoning born not only from ideology, but from the choices made during the Second World War, from the decisions of Chiang Kai-shek to prioritize foreign diplomacy and regular armies, from the slow, patient strategy of Mao Zedong to win over the countryside and wait for history to turn. In the end, the war against Japan had been a prelude, a necessary crucible through which both sides passed. But it had forged two entirely different nations within one border. In 1949, the Civil War ended at least on the battlefield. The communists took Beijing, the nationalists fled to the island of Taiwan, and for the first time in centuries, a single-party revolutionary state ruled the Chinese mainland. The world was left to watch, uncertain and divided. Was this the China they had fought alongside, or had they, in trying to save one version of China, inadvertently unleashed another? The legacy of the Second Sino-Japanese War remains etched in stone and memory in the ruins of Nanjing, where civilians were butchered in unspeakable crimes, in the high mountain passes of the Himalayas, where American planes vanished trying to keep a nation alive, in the jungles of Burma, where forgotten soldiers carved a road out of mud and blood, and in the diplomatic halls of San Francisco, where a battered, weary nation claimed its seat among the great powers of earth. But perhaps the most haunting legacy is the silence of what might have been. What if China had not held out in 1942? What if Japan had crushed the last remnants of its resistance before the Allies could arrive? Would the balance of World War II have shifted? Would the Pacific War have stretched years longer? Would the atomic bomb still have fallen, but on a different city? In a different language? History, as always, leaves no answers, only shadows. In the end, China's rise in 1945 was not a triumph of arms. It was a triumph of attrition, of survival over collapse, of patience over power. But as the old empires crumbled and the new Cold War dawned, China found itself at a crossroads. It had endured one of the deadliest wars in human history only to step into the fire of revolution. And so, while the guns had stopped, the battle for China's soul had just begun. A civil war, a Cold War, a global reckoning, but that is a story for another time.